Welcome, everyone. My name is Sarah Ray from the Bloomfield Public Library. We're so excited to have Sahara back with us today. We've done previous programs on cremation and funeral services, and today we're going to do something along the same lines but slightly different. We have the assassination and funeral of Abe Lincoln, and it is his birthday today, so we figured it'd be a good day to talk about Abe, and I'm going to turn the mic over to Sahara to take us away.
Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining. This story is very interesting and exciting to revisit, especially in today's world, and consider how things were done 160 years ago. So thank you for joining. As Sarah said, my name is Sahara Farrugio. I am a funeral director and owner of Smart Funeral Planning, which is a company that helps people prearrange their final arrangements. But for today, we're going to focus on Abraham Lincoln. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Sarah, can you give me a thumbs up that you can see that? Beautiful. Okay, so welcome to today's special event where we are commemorating the 160th anniversary, though a couple of months early, of the death and funeral of the 16th President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. Our sincere hope is that you will find this program both enjoyable and informative. 160 years ago, on April 15th, President Lincoln was murdered while watching a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. I am certain that everyone here is very familiar with those facts. But what you may not know is the story of the attempts to kidnap Lincoln well before the assassination, and also you might not know the story of his grand funeral that lasted 20 days. So sit back, relax, and let your mind become a time traveler. We are going back 160 years to 1865 to the White House in Washington, D.C. As you can see, there was a tremendous change in Lincoln's appearance over the 4 years that he served as our 16th president. Many scholars have speculated that Lincoln was suffering from Marfan's syndrome, which is a neurological condition where depression and lethargy are common. We know that Lincoln battled many bouts with depression and that his energy levels were most often depleted during his administration. One recent medical theory says that Lincoln was terminally ill, suffering from a rare form of cancer when he was shot. Regardless, by the time of April of 1864, Abraham Lincoln was a tired and careworn human being. Lincoln kept a file in his White House desk labeled Assassination. The president received scores of written threats against his life during his term in office. In fact, one person anonymously placed an advertisement in an Alabama newspaper offering to kill Lincoln for $1 million. Probably the most famous plot against Lincoln actually came during his inaugural trip at the very beginning of his presidency. Baltimore was a hotbed of secessionist fever. While Maryland never formally joined the Confederacy, there was a high-level anger and resentment towards Lincoln and his party's approach to slavery. There was an organization called the Knights of the Golden Circle, who were devoted to the Southern cause. One of the leaders of this group was this man, seen here to your left, named Cipriano Ferrandini, who was a hairdresser at the Barnum Hotel in downtown Baltimore. Ferrandini's assassination plan might have worked. Here is how it was supposed to go down. In Baltimore, passengers on a train coming in from Philadelphia had to take a horse-drawn trolley several blocks to get to the train station where the trains to Washington left from. Ferrandini's plot was to blow up the trolley and kill the president-elect even before he was sworn in. Fortunately, Pinkerton detectives discovered the plot and spirited Lincoln away to a new unidentified train, which safely took him to Washington. However, this event may well have ended up contributing in an odd way to Lincoln's own murder 4 years later. As you can see from the cartoon to your right, newspapers across the country ridiculed Lincoln as being a coward for slipping out of town. One newspaper reported that Lincoln had even dressed up as a woman to avoid the potential disaster. Regardless, this one event humiliated Lincoln so much that from then on, he was basically oblivious to danger all around him and shunned all protection. He once said to his private secretary, John Nicolay, "Nicolay, it is a very easy thing to kill a man. Don't worry too much about me." The woman to your left is Mary Surratt. Mrs. Surratt operated a boarding house in Washington, D.C., not too far from Ford's Theater. It was in this house that Secretary of War Edwin McMaster Stanton claimed was where the nest egg was hatched. We need to share that Mrs. Surratt was arrested as one of the major conspirators to assassinate Abraham Lincoln. She was sentenced to death by hanging, and the sentence was indeed carried out. Mary Surratt became the first woman to die legally on the gallows in the United States. The level of her involvement is still debated, but there is solid evidence that Mrs. Surratt was part of the plot. This is John Wilkes Booth as he appeared at the time he murdered President Lincoln. Booth was 26 years old at the time, and he had already established a reputation as one of the most famous actors in the country. Booth came from the Booths of Maryland. His father, Junius, and his brother, Edwin Booth, were highly regarded Shakespearean actors in their own right, and the Booth Theater in New York City was named after Edwin Booth. In 1865, the Booth family of actors would have been as well known to any American as the Barrymore or Sheen family would be familiar to us today. Booth was a white supremacist, a Southern zealot, and an egomaniac, and overall an extremely unpleasant person. And he blamed and hated Abraham Lincoln for all the woes suffered by his beloved South during the Civil War. Booth's ability to hate was deep and active. In all the presidential polls ever taken, Abraham Lincoln has always commanded the #1 position as America's greatest president. No question, a great part of that ranking comes from his courage and leadership through the dark and desolate years of the Civil War. One fascinating aspect of making a study of the Civil War is that no one, at the beginning of the war anyway, thought that anyone would die. Though at the end of the war, over 666,000 Americans were dead. All of Booth's kidnapping plans, all of his hopes for the success of the Confederacy vaporized on April 9th, 1865. On this day, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses Simpson Grant, and the great American Civil War was at an end. Up to this time, Booth had actually been working hard on an abduction plan, whereby he would kidnap Lincoln and hold him in ransom for all the Confederate prisoners of war that were being held in the northern prison camps. But when General Lee surrendered, abduction plans suddenly shifted into assassination plans. This gentleman has an interesting tale, which has become a part of the trivia of the Civil War. At the first Battle of Bull Run in Virginia, Mr. McLean had a farm near the battlefield site. During the fighting, a cannonball slammed through a wall of his house, and Farmer McLean packed up and quickly left for safer territory. Farmer McLean ended up selecting a farm at, of all places, Appomattox Courthouse. And it was 4 years later that General Lee surrendered to General Grant in Farmer McLean's parlor. One historian summed up McLean's fate this way: the Civil War started in his kitchen and it ended in his living room. On April 14th, 1865, 5 days after General Robert Lee surrendered, around noon, President Lincoln decided to attend the theater that evening. The president was very fond of comedies, and by chance, one of America's favorite comedies, Our American Cousin, was playing on stage at Ford's Theater. Lincoln had attended Ford's Theater many times and actually had seen John Wilkes Booth perform on other past occasions, although the two of them never formally met. President Lincoln loved Shakespeare's plays, but what he really enjoyed were the corny comedies that had senseless plots and crazy storylines which would make the president laugh and laugh all evening long. The star of this play, Our American Cousin, was the lady to your left, Miss Laura Keene. She was an extremely popular actress and excelled in the comic type of entertainment which Our American Cousin would offer. The plot of Our American Cousin is just plain silly by today's sensibilities. It is the story of one mishap after another that happens to a hick Iowa farmer when he visits his snooty English aristocratic relatives. The storyline, well, there isn't much of one, and the jokes are horrible. However, President Lincoln simply loved Our American Cousin. Some historians speculate that this naive Iowa farmer actually reminded President Lincoln of himself. Act 3, Scene 2 is very important. So John Wilkes Booth got word that Lincoln was going to attend the theater at Ford's around 4:00 p.m. that afternoon. Booth got his mail sent to Ford's, so he was a very familiar face in the theater building. No one knows precisely what Booth did for the rest of the evening, but we do know that he was drinking heavily. Around 8:00 at night, Lincoln and his party arrived. The president, as usual, is running late. When Lincoln entered the theater, the play stopped and the orchestra played Hail to the Chief. An exhausted Lincoln bowed once and moved into box 7, where he would watch the play with his wife Mary and his two guests, Miss Clara Harris and Major Henry Reed Rathbone. Following the assassination, Miss Harris and Major Rathbone are married and move to Germany, where, in an insane rage, Rathbone stabs his wife to death and spends the rest of his life in a German insane asylum. But anyways, besides that, back to our story, it's around 10 p.m., Act 3, Scene 2. Being an experienced actor, Booth knows that in this particular scene, one lone actor will be on stage and will utter a line which was guaranteed to bring the house down. Booth planned that when the crowd began to laugh, that would be the time he would pull the trigger of his one-shot Derringer. It is now about 10:15 p.m., and the actor, Harry Hawk, seen on your left, is standing alone on the stage. Hawk utters what most historians believe were the last words Abraham Lincoln heard, which were, "You old sockdologizing man-trap." The crowd began laughing, and out of nowhere, a puff of blue smoke emanated from box 7, where the president was sitting, and Mrs. Lincoln began screaming, "They killed him. They killed him." As you can see, the one-shot Derringer bullet traveled straight across Lincoln's brain and lodged just before and above his left eye. Even if Lincoln would have been today at Johns Hopkins Hospital, the wound would have proven mortal. It is indeed interesting that John Wilkes Booth used a single-shot Derringer. This was his typical high drama, befitting of a dramatic actor, and with a 1-ounce ball of lead, the entire fate of the future of the United States of America hinged. Booth had barred the door leading to box 7, so his only escape route was to jump out of the box and run across the stage and exit through the back alley door of the theater. As Booth stood up on the railing of the box, his spur caught on the flag draping the box, and as he jumps, he lost his balance, and when he landed, he fell hard on his left heel and fractured his tibia at the ankle. He now had a broken leg. Booth limped across stage center and, wielding a knife, yells the words, "Sic semper tyrannis," which translates to, "Thus always to tyrants." It is taken from Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. With his dramatic exit, Booth vanishes into the night. and the theater is left in bedlam. Now, we're going to get into some other plots that are taking place at the same time. So John Wilkes Booth's master plan, simply put, was to execute the top 3 government officials of the United States at the same time and hence paralyze the federal government. And he came exceptionally close to succeeding. Booth failed only because he recruited a band of buffoons to carry out the rest of his master plan. Booth assigned this man, George Atzerodt, an alcoholic carriage maker from Port Tobacco, Virginia, to assassinate Vice President Andrew Johnson. Atzerodt instead gets drunk, chickens out, and is arrested the next morning, hung over in a stable. Vice President Johnson is completely unaware of the intended plot until later in the day after he is sworn in as the 17th president of the United States. Also taking place at the same time, Booth assigns Lewis Payne and a half-wit drugstore clerk, David Harold, to go over to the home of Secretary of State William Henry Seward and kill him. Harold is included in Booth's plan because Payne is totally unfamiliar with the streets in Washington, and Harold's job is to lead Payne out of town after the murder. Okay. Now, with this, interesting to note, 2 weeks prior to this, Secretary Seward had been involved in a horrible carriage accident, which left him with a broken jaw and several broken ribs. This night, he is recuperating in his bed and is being tended to by his son and daughter. Seward's physicians had used a metal cast held into place with leather straps to keep Seward's bones in place. So he's got a metal cast on when these assassins come in to get him. So all this happened between 10 and 10:30 p.m. on April 14th, 1865. At about 10:15, around the time Lincoln is being murdered, Payne and Harold ride up to the dark and closed home of Seward. Payne is pretending to be a pharmacy clerk delivering a prescription to Seward. When the door is open, he barges in, runs upstairs, and begins to pistol whip Seward's son. Next, Payne lunges into Seward's bedroom and starts stabbing the elderly gentleman savagely. The only thing that saved Seward's life was that he rolled over on his side and Payne's knife kept hitting the metal body cast. Meanwhile, back at Ford's Theater, the man to your left is Dr. Charles Leal. He was a 23-year-old physician and was attending the play that night. Leal was the first physician to reach Abraham Lincoln. To get Leal into the box, remember now that they had bolted the door from the inside, Booth had, so they had to hoist him over the railing. And once inside, he found the president was not breathing. Leal did artificial respiration, and Lincoln finally took a deep breath. Then Leal probed for a wound and found, through Lincoln's matted hair, a blood clot behind the surface of the wound. Leal removed the blood clot, and Lincoln's breathing became better. Even still, Dr. Leal determined quickly that Lincoln would never survive the trip back to the White House. So 6 soldiers loaded up the president and walked out of Ford's Theater onto 10th Street, and they really had no idea where to go. When they were out on 10th Street, a voice from right across the street called out, "Bring him in here." So it was that the President of the United States was carried into a common boarding house and taken to a back bedroom, which was extremely small. The bed they placed the president on was so short that they positioned Lincoln diagonally on the bed so that he could fit, and even still, his feet kept slipping off the bed throughout the death watch. Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton took charge of everything. He arrived at the Peterson boarding house and immediately began giving orders and making arrests. He shut down Ford's Theater and arrested all the actors. He then telegraphed the news of Lincoln's assassination across the country. And when Lincoln did die, it was probably Secretary Stanton who uttered the immortal words, "Now he belongs to the ages." 7:22 a.m. on the morning of April 15th, 1865, was Abraham Lincoln's last breath. And this is the bed that he died in. He was only 56 years of age. And with the death of the 16th president, the history of the United States of America was instantly and irrevocably changed. At the beginning of the Civil War, unbelievably, nobody thought that anyone would actually be killed. At the end of the war, however, around 666,000 Americans were dead. The urgent need to care for the dead created immediate problems, and President Lincoln ordered the Quartermaster's Corps to employ what were called embalming surgeons. These men were usually physicians or pharmacists and would literally follow the different armies on both the north and south sides of the conflict. And as you can see, they would set up their embalming tents and begin their work. President Lincoln believed very much in the value of embalming, and he had had several experiences with it. Most notably was when his son, Willie Lincoln, died of a fever during the war. Willie is seen here on your right. The embalming surgeon firm of Brown and Alexander was called to embalm Willie, and the man on your left, Henry P. Cattell, was the embalmer who performed this service to the Lincoln family. Hence, when President Lincoln died, Mr. Cattell was called on once again to embalm the president. Following their dastardly deed, Booth and Harold met up with each other south of Washington on April 15th, 1865. Booth's broken leg was causing him tremendous pain, and at around 4:30 in the morning, the two assassins arrived at the farm home of Dr. Samuel Mudd. Historians still are debating the depth of involvement of Dr. Mudd in the overall assassination plot, but regardless, Dr. Mudd set Booth's leg and hence was one of the first persons arrested as a member of the conspiracy to kill President Lincoln. Dr. Mudd spent a several-year prison term for his involvement. Many people today still adhere to Mudd's innocence, but regardless, something very interesting came from what happened to Dr. Mudd. The American slang phrase, "your name will be mud," came from what happened to the good doctor. April 19th, 1865 was the day that Abraham Lincoln had his funeral, the first funeral, we should say, in the East Room of the White House. This is the coffin that Lincoln was placed in. It was made of solid walnut and cost a stunning $1,500. I guess in 2025, that would translate probably closer to, I don't know, 100,000. You guys can do the math on that, 1865, 1,500 inflation. It was a very expensive casket. President Lincoln had, without question, the largest, most impressive funeral service ever held in the United States. This is a map of the funeral procession route. The funeral procession traveled 1,700 miles, and Lincoln's funeral lasted 20 days. Lincoln had funerals in Washington, Baltimore, Harrisburg, Philadelphia, New York City, Albany, Buffalo, Cleveland, Columbus, Indianapolis, Chicago, and Springfield. As the nation mourned their assassinated president, Booth and Harold made a futile dash to cross the Potomac and get safely into Virginia, where they expected to be greeted with glee. Booth believed that once in the South, he would be hailed a hero. Spoiler alert, they were not greeted as heroes in the South. While Booth and Harold wandered aimlessly, trying to escape in the brush and woods on the banks of the Potomac, at 6:40 p.m. on April 21st, 1865, the Lincoln funeral train pulled into York, Pennsylvania, en route to Philadelphia. There were no formal funeral services planned, but a group of York women were given permission to enter the funeral car and place a memorial wreath on Lincoln's coffin. There were some raised eyebrows in York, because the Democratic newspaper refused to decorate their building in mourning. But other than that, all went smoothly. So these are all of Lincoln's hearses. And as you can see from the illustrations, the variety and design of the various hearses that were used on the president's funeral covered a wide array of styles and materials. One fact is known, however, and that is that each city that Lincoln's remains entered made gallant attempts to outdo all the other cities where Lincoln's remains had been in state by making more and more elaborate hearses. This was part of vintage Victorian funeral practices. And this is the only photograph of Lincoln in his coffin that has survived. This photograph was taken in New York City Hall. There were many photographs taken of the president in his coffin, but Secretary of War Stanton confiscated all of them. You see, Stanton had a phobia about death, and hence he destroyed every photograph of Lincoln in his coffin except this one. This photograph was lost until 1951, when a Springfield, Illinois high school student who was doing a research paper on Lincoln discovered it hidden within the papers of one of Lincoln's private secretaries. Here is another tidbit of history trivia. The tale of a future president and his brother who became the father of a future first lady. All right, so let's unpack that. If you look at the window, which is circled in red, you are looking at two brothers. One is Theodore Roosevelt and the other is Elliott Roosevelt. Of course, Theodore Roosevelt later became president of the United States, and his brother Elliott Roosevelt was the father of Eleanor Roosevelt, who married Franklin Delano Roosevelt, becoming First Lady of the land. The Lincoln funeral procession marched directly in front of the Roosevelt home in New York City. As the Lincoln funeral procession entered Albany, New York, John Wilkes Booth and David Harold are being surrounded by federal troops at the Garrett Farm in Virginia. Booth and Harold were sleeping in the Garrett tobacco barn when the soldiers surrounded them. David Harold gave himself up immediately, but Booth decided to fight it out until the end. The troops set the barn on fire. Suddenly, there was a gunshot, and Booth stumbled out of the barn, shot fatally through the neck. Booth was taken to the front porch of the Garrett farm, where he uttered his final words, "Useless, useless," and he died. So this is the Grand Chicago Funeral Arch. And as you can see, the opulence and grandeur of Lincoln's funeral simply got larger and larger as the various cities further down the funeral procession had days instead of hours to prepare ahead of time. And they took full advantage of that time opportunity, making this funeral procession as spectacular as possible. Home at last. So finally, in early May, Lincoln's remains were home at last. His remains were laid in state in the House of Representatives chamber in the Illinois State House, where Lincoln had given his famous House Divided speech. President Lincoln gave one funeral instruction. During a carriage ride with his wife Mary, just after the war had ended, the president said this: "Mother, you will outlive me. When I die, bury me in a quiet place." The quiet place Mrs. Lincoln selected was the receiving vault at the Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield, Illinois. The original receiving vault can still be seen, and on your right is the new Lincoln tomb. Justice was swift in the 1860s. Lincoln died on April 15th, and 4 of the conspirators were hung on July 7th, 1865. Sentenced to death were Mrs. Surratt, George Atzerodt, David Harold, and Lewis Payne. I'm sure you're wondering, But what happened to John Wilkes Booth's body? When Booth's body was brought back to Washington, a post-mortem examination was conducted on board the ship Montauk. The image on your upper right is what the government told the American people was the fate of Booth's body, that it was sunk in a river close to Washington. But that story was untrue. Booth's body was actually buried under a cell floor in the very prison where the other conspirators were awaiting execution. Booth's body remained there until 1869, when President Andrew Johnson gave permission for Booth's family to claim their famous relative. Today, John Wilkes Booth is buried in an unmarked grave at the Greenmount Cemetery in Baltimore, Maryland. Now, I know that everybody loves a conspiracy theory, at least most Americans do. The TV abounds with programs concerning plots, intrigue, and mystery. The notion took off in the early part of the 20th century that John Wilkes Booth had actually escaped and had died in Oklahoma as an old man. One enterprising businessman even got hold of the poor deceased Oklahoma man and mummified the body and put the body in a carnival sideshow, as you can see from these images. Does this mummy look anything like John Wilkes Booth to you? Who knows? Unfortunately, President Lincoln did not rest in peace. In the 1870s, a serious attempt was made to steal the body of President Lincoln. These two hoodlums from Chicago plotted the theft of Lincoln's body and actually used the tools in the center to break into the Lincoln tomb. And they actually had Lincoln's body out of the tomb and were making their own way out when, again, Pinkerton detectives had found out about the plot and were waiting outside of the Lincoln tomb and nabbed the two grave robbers. Interestingly, however, neither of these men ever went to prison for their deed because in the 1870s, the state of Illinois had no laws against grave robbing. And I'm not sure if it was with the Bloomfield Library, but a whole nother presentation that we can have is the history of grave robbing, which is very fascinating. Okay, the remains of Abraham Lincoln were finally and forever buried on September 21st, 1901. From 1865 to 1901, Lincoln's body had been moved at least 13 times. The yellow arrow points to the metal encasement which held Abraham Lincoln's body. Lincoln was finally and forever interred in a steel cage and then surrounded with 10 tons of concrete. The young boy on your left is named Fleetwood Lindsay. He was 10 years old when they moved Lincoln's body for the last time. His father was on the committee overseeing the transfer, and he allowed Fleetwood to play hooky from school to witness the historic event. They opened up Lincoln's coffin for a final identification, and Fleetwood viewed Lincoln's remains. Mr. Lindsay died knowing that he was the last human being alive to gaze upon the features of our 16th president. Friends, this then is the story of Lincoln's assassination and grand funeral. It has all the pieces of a great murder mystery, made all the more fascinating because it is true. Over the last 160 years, the reputation of Abraham Lincoln has continued to climb in reverence and admiration by the American public. The reputation of John Wilkes Booth, however, continues to be negated by the recollection of his act of brutality in killing a great American president. The memory of Abraham Lincoln is truly everlasting in the hearts of his countrymen. So I'd like to close today's presentation by reciting the final paragraph of Lincoln's second inaugural address, where he offers a poet's version of the new hope for freedom for everybody in the United States of America, and beyond that, for all nations. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Before I sign off, I just want to give a special thanks to Mr. Todd Van Beck. He was the author of this program and a nationally recognized authority for our industry as funeral directors. So I'd just like to thank him, and may he also rest in peace because he has recently passed. So that's it for me. And Sarah, I thank you so much.